Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the Tattoo Historians Digital Conference this morning. It's been a great morning so far. It's going to continue to be a great morning because I have my new friend, Dr. Samantha Cutrara, on with me right now. Thank you, Samantha, for being on. Really appreciate this. At the end of March, History Education Strategist Dr. Samantha Cutrara began a video series asking historians and history educators about how history and the teaching of history might change during and after COVID-19. After 35 videos, this series has acted and is acting as a time capsule of the ways our ideas about the pandemic have developed, but has also been an important guide for the key themes related to teaching and learning history that need to be considered for the future of the profession. In this presentation, Dr. Cutrara will talk about the lessons from the Pandemic Pedagogy series that will be important for academic historians, Twitter historians, public historians, and others who are thinking about history and history education in the next decade of the 21st century. And I also want to say thank you for having me as a part of the Pandemic Pedagogy series as well. That was a great time.
Yeah, it was wonderful to connect with you to promote this conference. So it's nice to come full circle.
Yes, thank you so much for that. And I will give you the floor and I will mute my mic and you can begin. Thank you so much again.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It is really great to be here. And by here, I mean, obviously like in my house and in your houses too. It is wonderful to be able to talk about the Pandemic Pedagogy series because it has had such an interesting and far-reaching reach. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to introduce myself a little bit as a segue into an introduction to the series. And then I'm going to talk about 5 different things, 5 different elements of pandemic pedagogy that I think is really useful to pull into our teaching, learning, mobilizing the past practices as we go into the fall term. Now, I also recognize that not all of you are educators in like the most traditional sense of the term, but I really think of teaching history as mobilizing the past. And so if you're an academic historian and you actually haven't taught a class, I still consider you working through the archives and writing articles as an element of teaching history. So even if that isn't even if that's not the way that you understand your work, I just want you to know that that is the umbrella that I am thinking of. So as John said, my name is Dr. Samantha Cutrara. I've been a history education strategist for about 15 to 20 years. And what that means is that I help individuals, organizations, historians, archives, develop education programs that, in my view, are transformative, meaningful, and inclusive for students. So, and students, by students, I mean audiences too. So I really think about ways that not only are we doing history, but we are doing history in ways that other people can see and other people can access. I wrote a blog post a couple of weeks ago during the Black Lives Matter protest that said, if you're not doing history to make change, then what the F are you doing it for? Because I do think that the ways that we mobilize the past should be ways that are meaningful, transformative, and inclusive. So with that in mind, I started a video series in January, primarily to promote my upcoming book, Transforming the Canadian History Classroom, Imagining a New We, that's going to be coming out in late summer, early fall of this year, which I'm very excited about. I started a blog post just with a couple different things that mainly K-12 educators could think about as they develop their lessons in their classrooms. And then when the pandemic came to North America in ways that made us go into lockdown, I started thinking about the series and I started thinking about the work that I do generally. And I was like, what does this mean? What does history education going to mean in this new context? And I remember I was walking down the street and it was like a very gray day and I was just surrounded by concrete. And I was just like, is history just navel gazing? Like, why are we doing history when there are thousands and thousands of people dying, and we all have stay-at-home orders. Like, what does this mean? So I posted a video where I just said that, like, I don't know how to understand this moment from a history education point of view. And what was really cool about that, what I now see as a very sad little video, what was really cool about that was a lot of people got in touch with me, like friends in the profession, and said, you know, I'm thinking about those questions too. So I was like, let's do that on camera, kind of like John does. Let's do that on camera. So I started asking people, could we talk about history and history education for the video series? Let me ask you 3 questions. Question 1 is a question about the present. Have you thought about history any different because of this moment? Question 2 is about the future. Do you think the way we teach history or mobilize the past will change after this moment? And the third question is kind of linked to the ideas in my book, Imagining a New We. Do you think we're going to get a chance to imagine a new we during or after this moment? Because for me, this notion of building and rebuilding a we is a very affective, emotional, physical, tangible experience. And so now if we're all in our homes and we're doing distance learning, how does that community get developed? You know, one of the things that I was really thinking about is the cliche when people say, like, you know, we learn history not to repeat mistakes of the future. But one of the like underlying kind of like bugs that I had underneath those questions that I asked people was like, we're in it now. Like, we can't use that cliche. We're whether we're repeating it or not, we're in it. So how do we understand history during this moment? So as John said, I talked to 38 people. There are going to be 35 videos by the end of June from a range of different people. Academic historians, public historians, people that work in museums, a grade 2 teacher, grade 10 teachers, history professors, archivists, librarians, comic book creators. It's been such a wonderfully diverse conversation. And what's been interesting is that there have been some key themes that have come from this. So with the remainder of my time, I want to talk about those 5 themes. The first theme that has come up is about structures. Now, I'm going to bring in a little bit of post-structural theory right now, even though the participants didn't necessarily use post-structural theory. But we often talk about deconstruction, like Derrida's idea of deconstruction as like breaking things apart. But actually, deconstruction is about witnessing how the structures that we take for granted, the structures that we think are natural, are actually broken. They're always broken. They were designed broken. They are like a house of cards that were built up in order to make it look big and solid, but they're actually quite hollow inside. The first theme that came up in the series was that we are witnessing right now the deconstruction of structures. It's one thing to say our structures are broken, but it's another thing to say the structures were designed broken. The structures were designed broken in ways that this actually kind of makes sense. The structures were designed broken, and so right now we are watching how that brokenness works in real time. So with that, if you are thinking about teaching history or mobilizing the past, moving from the pandemic, although I don't mean like after the pandemic, I mean like in the next few months, think about structures. Think about how you can bring into your classrooms, how you can bring into your writing the idea that structures are not natural or solid, but that we are witnessing the deconstruction of structures. The structures were designed, these hegemonic structures, these white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist structures were designed to reward some and fail others. So that's not just about laws and legislations, but how laws and legislations, policies and practices, things like that operationalize and get continued in in a timeline really of strength in some ways and weaknesses in others. So if we're thinking about structures, we can think more about how we can understand ourselves within those structures. So that's the first thing that came up. The ways that the structures are broken, the ways that we can watch the structures being broken, the structures that are broken, and that we can develop our conversations around the past through that kind of idea. The second idea comes from that, and that is about inequities. Everyone that I spoke to talked about the inequities of a lot of the things that we're seeing, of the inequities that are being exacerbated by the pandemic, things like access to food, access to a laptop to do schoolwork, access to internet connections to do schoolwork. A lot of people use the phrase, we're all in the same boat. But we're not all in the same boat. And so to think about how these inequities manifest, and that they aren't like the structures, they aren't this natural thing that came up, but it is a process and a product of an interwoven, interlocking system. And that we need to ensure that we are talking about inequities, not just as something that like, there were also poor people. But we need to bring those stories front and center to the ways that we talk about the past in order to ensure that those voices are heard, but to ensure when we reflect on this moment that the ways that the system is failing a lot of different people who are marginalized, who get marginalized through those systems, their voices are able to be heard in the narrative as well. Now, this is even more important, and this we are witnessing what this looks like with the Black Lives Matter protests, that people are saying the systems are not working for us, the systems were not designed to work for us, and therefore there are great inequities that need to be addressed. Bring those histories up to the front, because again, as I said in that blog post, one of the superpowers of historians is to show what things were like in the past, to be able to read and research and be able to bring those ideas in. So bring those ideas in, center those conversations about inequities. The third thing, and you might be thinking this as I'm talking about inequities, is the ways that we valorize archives and records, but the limitations of those records and archives as well. So right now we are living in a moment in which it is being recorded in a way, well, I guess a couple moments that being recorded in a way that no other pandemic, no other social movement had been before. And I spoke to archivists who talk about the glut of records that are happening at this moment. But as I was walking around my neighborhood, my urban neighborhood in the spring, I was looking at the buildings around me and thinking how the archives will never reflect back all of the different lives that are being lived in these buildings across the street from me, in my building itself, and that we can't fetishize the archives to such an extent that we don't leave room for the creativity and the imagination that brings those voices in that have been silenced and that are silenced because of the archives. Let me just grab a sip of tea, 1 second. Cold tea, I should say. Yes, as archivists, we want evidence. We want evidence to support our ideas. But if we are thinking about inequities and we are thinking about structures, then we also have to recognize that the records are imperfect, they are not complete, and that there does need to be some element of acknowledging that in ways that allow those voices to come in. And so if you are in the classroom, for example, ask your students to reflect on what they recorded during this moment and also what they didn't, and how that helps them shape their ideas about what a historical narrative could be and could do, as a way to then think about the historical narratives that they are learning themselves. I wrote another blog post a couple weeks ago called The Last Normal Photo. So there was a last normal photo hashtag going around. And I talked about how I was flipping through the camera roll on my phone and I could see the last normal photo, but I didn't want to share it. It was too painful. Even though it wouldn't have been painful to everyone else. I wrote in a narrative. I was able to see a narrative in my photos that an archivist in 10 years, 50 years, even someone just flipping through my camera roll right now would not see. So allow that ambiguity, allow that humanness to come in to how you mobilize the past. Another element of this is to help foreground the ideas that we are all historical agents. This has come up so much in the series. Everyone is saying, like, we are in a historical moment. Let's help young people or the audiences that you work with or the audiences of your writing to keep that in mind, that just because this is a pandemic, just because this is a social revolution and we are hyper aware of the ways that we are placed in a particular historical moment, that doesn't mean that 6 months ago we were not also in a historical moment. So bring that notion of historical actors, of individuals into your teaching and learning and mobilizing practices. And again, this might come from a little bit of imagination because of the limitations of records and archives, and that this imagination helped recognize the inequities that we have in our society that are from structures that are designed to be inequitable. You see what I did there? Like, that was a nice build up because all of those things are interlocking. And to conclude, the fifth thing that has come up so strongly in both the series, but also in conversations that I have participated in, that I have watched, that I've listened to online during the pandemic, which is, you don't need to be an expert. Actually, that part hasn't been in the conversations. That's the part I'm telling you. I'm getting to the part in the conversations. You don't need to be an expert. As an educator, you think you need to be an expert because that is the way our education system has been structured. But it is okay to show the humanity of this moment, both for yourself as an educator and for your students. And that is the key element that keeps coming up. Your students are confused and anxious and don't know what's going on, although they might not manifest that or articulate it to you. You are also confused and anxious and don't know what's going on. Use that moment of humanity to be able to bring class together, to say, rather than just do a series of lectures, or rather than just do this writing that's just going to tell people this history I want them to know, identify that ambiguity. Let's explore these things together. Let's identify, like, that I didn't know about Juneteenth, for example. If you learned about Juneteenth for the first time yesterday, for example, let's learn together what this is about. Allow that humanity for yourself, and also for your students. So have more creative assignments. Think about the digital humanities. I wrote a digital humanities instructor's guide 2 years ago now for people that weren't familiar with the digital humanities, to be able to think about, like, how can we do like an online exhibit rather than an essay as a final assignment. But I also said, like, you don't need to use fancy equipment. Like, you can just do an online exhibit through PowerPoint. That's fine. So think about a creative exploration between you and your students in your teaching practices, in their learning practices, and the assessment and evaluation practices. In doing this, what you can do is allow for space for imagination, a space to reflect on records and archives. It allows space for inequity. It allows space to think about those structures. And it allows them, most importantly, to understand themselves as historical actors and historical creators. And I think that when we are mobilizing the past, when we are teaching history, that should be our goal. Because, like I said, if you are not doing history to make change and transform the world with the stories that you found in the archives through your research, then what the fuck are we doing it for? And with that wonderful swear word, I'm done. Questions?
Awesome. That's awesome. And I'm so very appreciative of your words, even the curse words. That's fine, because we need to be real here. We need to be real.
I could have done more. I could have done more.
That's fine. That's fine. But no, it's getting back to the point of authenticity and being real with our students, no matter if they're students in the classroom or students in the field, quote unquote students, visitors. Being authentic, being real, being genuine in how we teach the past, like you've so eloquently put. There is a great question in the comments here from Gary. How you measure that your recommendations are truly being implemented in schools? It's a really interesting question.
Gary, that's a good question. I mean, I can't measure that. I can't measure that at all. I spoke to the president of the Ontario Black History Society, Natasha Henry, a few weeks ago, and one of the important elements of her work is making sure that there are greater curriculum recommendations in Canadian history curriculum representing Black history. And I said to her off camera, like, that's a really cool goal, but I don't know if those big structural things can happen. I mean, I think they can happen now. A lot has happened since we spoke. So my focus is just on building a community of educators, historians that are open and comfortable with doing this work. The more that we are open and comfortable, the more educators can bring that into the classrooms. And then hopefully the things that I am advocating for, the things that I'm recommending are going to be coming into classrooms. But I can't measure that. I can only hope and see the kind of reactions that I get. And I do have a couple research projects that are kind of like in the works right now, which would allow me to go into classrooms, but that's always hard research. So we'll see if some of these pandemic pedagogy ideas can become a research project, but that is a little bit of a TBD.
I had a statement the other week when I was on with my good friend, Dr. Peter Carmichael, and Kevin Levin the other week, and we were talking about the current situation. And I said, as historians, I really think it's important for us, just like the general public, to listen to understand instead of listening to respond. And that goes back to my idea that as historians, we are forever going to be students. And I really liked your input on listening to the student voice just as much as they listen to ours, kind of like a middle ground, especially during a trying time such as a pandemic or when there's protests on the streets for anything, that we listen to understand instead of listening to respond. I think that from the videos I've watched that you have created, which I did put a link in the comments to your YouTube channel, I think that's something that we've seen across the board from a lot of these educators you've had on, that they are now doing maybe a little bit more listening than they were 5 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I have two kind of comments to that. I'm gonna think about just academic, like university and college classrooms for a second.
Sure.
Those classrooms are often designed as teaching reverence for the discipline and the subject. Like, you need to know the survey course in order for you to get to the slightly more specific course in second year to then do your seminars in third and fourth year. And when you are just foregrounding the reverence for the subject, you are ignoring the fact that there are these young people in the room that are dying to learn history. And I don't say that lightly. The students that I spoke to in my research are saying, like, yes, we want to learn history, but you need to bring it to the table. So for academic historians teaching in university and colleges, I really just want you to be aware of, like, if you were teaching reverence for the subject, you are not allowing space for exploration with your young people. And if you are a K-12 teacher, then there is a lot more space, especially in the Canadian curriculum. I know American standards are a little bit different, to co-create what happens in the classroom. And that really needs to be such a key element of the ways that we are thinking about history education. We are doing it for the young people in the room, and not, again, for them to like know why that statue is the most important statue, but how can we contest and challenge and develop these narratives that could question why we have statues in the first place, for example.
Barry Davis has a great question, and he's a baseball fan, so I'm going to take it. He says, do you see distance learning having a negative impact on making education hands-on? He goes into how he uses virtual teaching and social distancing guidelines, but it's not interactive as he would like it to be. Do you see this having a negative impact on making education hands-on? Thank you for that question, Barry.
Barry, that is a great question. The baseball stuff that I know is that League of Their Own is a great movie. That's my extent.
We'll start there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I have a couple things to say to that. One, I'm not going to answer your question about distance learning having a negative impact, because it doesn't matter. We're doing it now. I mean, to be honest, yes, that was my fear, but we're in it now. So it is hard to kind of detach from that. What I would recommend, and I really want to validate that as a question, because I think it is really challenging, and that this is why I think even more it's important that we are thinking of our classrooms as a collaboration exploration, because the hands-on can actually be a mental hands-on, right, rather than that tangible. But what I recommend is thinking about the digital humanities work that has been around way longer than the pandemic. How can you get your students to build an exhibit? Again, just use PowerPoint slides. It doesn't need to be a fancy whatever. How students do a digital story on Instagram or TikTok, which, as John knows, I don't know about. I don't really want to think about it, but students know about it. So that hands-on, you can ask your students to engage on that. Like, what can we do an Instagram story that helps bring out a couple different elements in this primary source letter? Or can you do an Instagram story that shows what was happening before and after this historical photograph was taken? So, John, what I'll do also is provide links to the Digital Humanities book, as well as some of my other work. The Digital Humanities work, like I'm in no way an expert, but it's a very extensive bibliography and references to other work. But use that as a helpful model of hands-on, because people have done this work way longer than the pandemic.
And Barry did agree with you about that. That is a great movie, The League of Their Own. I'm a major league fan, Barry. So, but I play baseball, so that's my thing. But I want to get back to the message at hand here. Richard Houston has 42 years of teaching high school. Schools are judged in finance on standard tests, which this is the American outlook on it, and I'm sure in Canada too there are issues with this. Suggestions on how to force a refocus on history requirements. And I will say that I have seen here in the United States a downturn in the arts and humanities field from the history standpoint since the early 2000s, when we had the act of No Child Left Behind. Really cut a lot of our arts and humanities to concentrate on STEM. And we see that here. I don't know how it is in Canada when I let you go into that, but I really liked his question about suggestions on how to force a refocus on history requirements, maybe inside or outside the classroom, really.
I just want to actually say one more thing about that last question before I talk about that, because I meant to reference you actually in the last question, because in my video with you and in my video with the Slave Dwelling Project and my video with Kat Ackerfield from the Toronto's First Post Office, all three people that were really public history focused all talked about changing narratives during this time of remote and online and virtual and distance learning as a way to like keep audiences. And John, you said like, I want it to be a creative bubble. I want it to keep going. And so I also recommend digital humanities, but also public historians that have like worked really hard of changing their narrative so that people will still engage with them, because you already know the like narratives of the like plantation houses, for example. Mm-hmm. So to get back to that other question, yeah, I totally understand it. And an element of that question for me too is that when history education is brought in as a way to develop skills rather than a way to explore narratives, because that is actually like STEMifying the work of history. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I can't like change the world. I mean, I'm trying, but I can't like change the world in terms of those standards. But these are things that I recommend that you ensure that your students know when they enter the classrooms, that history and narratives and stories are important. You can start the day with like, on this day, did you know that? And provide a reading list, or bring in an archival image that you show during class, and have students do a graffiti wall, which is you post the picture. This is obviously in a classroom, but oh no, you can do this online too. You post like a photograph or an image, and just get students like throughout the day to like write things that they are seeing, write things that they are feeling, write things that they have questions about, as a way for them to engage kind of privately with that image. It's private because you don't know who's doing it, but it's public because everyone can see. So there are ways that you can highlight that history is important, even if you don't have 3 hours, 70 minutes, 60 minutes, 50 minutes, 30 minutes to devote to it every day in the classroom. It can be a way to start your classroom. You can have your classrooms, like I said, designed with historical references, reading lists, poems that you can get students to think about that. So it's not just curriculum, and this kind of goes back to that first question. It's not just like measuring how and in what ways that we can see this in the curriculum, but it is bringing in an affective care that stories from the past matter to students' lives in the present, and that we as adults have a responsibility to help them, to see themselves and to see new things in our spaces of teaching and learning.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to piggyback off that point, Samantha, is that there are times when you have to go outside of your comfort zone as an educator or an interpreter to reach that audience. I never would have thought we would have had something like we're doing today, or we're doing a digital conference, but here we are. But it's outside of some people's comfort zone, and that's fine. But and like you said earlier, I'm on TikTok. Why? Because most historians aren't on TikTok. So I usually go where no one else is, because I'm going to figure it out and find out. But that's where the 16-year-olds are, who need to, or who desire to have some sort of historical narrative, if they're history nerds like I was. And we went over that in my video, and you've gone over it in others as well. And I'm very, very appreciative of what you have built on YouTube. And as I've said previously, I for everyone listening, I put a link in the comments. I also pinned a link to your upcoming book from UBC Press.
Thank you.
So that's pinned in the comments there as well. But what you have done has been a tremendous service at this time, because we need to have these voices coming together to engage each other and say, what are you working on? How has it worked? What is this idea of the new we? And moving forward from there. I think that was tremendous. So thank you so much for that, Samantha. It really means a lot to me as a historian, a public historian, and possibly an academic someday, who knows. But for my public historian side of it, it really means a lot to me to be able to gather all these voices and bring it all together.
Yeah, and it means a lot to me too, which is why it was really great for us to connect, because there have been a lot of attempps, that are very successful attempts of bringing together different people that talk about history in different ways. But I was talking to a grade 2 teacher, which actually happens to be like the video that has the most views, which is really cool. And she was like, I never really thought of myself as a curator, but now for Asian Heritage Month, I am like curating things for my little learners. And then the next day, two academic historians that I like and I'm familiar with, they were talking about like, how do we redesign our syllabi for the fall? And someone said, think of yourself as a curator. And I was like, who else said that? A grade 2 teacher. Grade 2 teachers come in with such wonderful creative ideas because their learners are different. But those 25-year-olds in your classroom or those 16-year-olds in the classroom, like inside, they're also 7-year-olds that kind of want to play and learn and explore. And, we need to remember that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this.
Thank you,
Samantha. This has been fantastic as always. And I'm really looking forward to getting on your side of the border to bring this brand to Ontario and see what happens with it. I don't know if a lot of Ontario is ready for this, but we will find out.
Definitely not. They're definitely not. But I just feel like both you and I will just like motor through and make sure it gets done anyway. So thank you so much for having me a part of the virtual conference. I don't know if you can see, John, that I did a Padlet link in the private chat that you maybe can share as well. And that is a link to most of my public work, videos, blog posts, things like that. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone, for tuning in, for all of your comments, questions. It really means a lot to those of us who are involved in this process today, all 7 of us. And it really means a lot that you all are watching and taking part in this, because a lot of us have had scheduled talks canceled, have had discussions canceled where we were just going to help out an organization, maybe with their digital media footprint or whatever it may be. We're having students who've done great papers who had those conferences delayed or canceled. And I'm just very appreciative that all of you have tuned in today on a Saturday morning so far, and have tuned in great numbers to take part in this, because I think this is very important for us to have an open dialogue about not only what Dr. Cutrara has talked about, but also what all of our presenters are going to showcase. They're showcasing the future of the field, or how we see the future of this field going forward. We all have opinions of what that may be, but that's the beauty of this process. And I'm really appreciative of all of you tuning into this. And Dr. Cutrara, obviously, I'm very appreciative of you and all of your work. And I'm happy to call you a friend in this process. And I can't wait to work hand in hand with you once I get up there and trying to figure out this new and this narrative going forward with the history field.
Yeah, let's do it. We can't wait to have you in Canada. And I think it will be a really powerful way to like rethink a lot of our public and academic practices. So we are looking forward to having you here too. And I also want to say Happy Father's Day to anyone that is celebrating.
Oh, there you go. Is today Father's Day in Canada?
No, it's tomorrow.
It's tomorrow.
I mean, it's also Father's Day.
I think we had ours, didn't we? No, we may not. I don't talk to my dad. I'm sorry. There's no talk with my father. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, there's actually really like no fathers in my like life either, but I know that there are fathers. So happy Father's Day.
There are a few out there. A couple in the comments. So take care of yourself, guys. Make sure your kids call you, unlike what I do. But no.
This is becoming a therapy session.
Yeah, this is quickly turning. This is another half hour. Thank you so much, Samantha. Really appreciate that.
No problem.
And really appreciate all of you done. And I appreciate all of you in the comments section for hanging out, even through this strange way of ending this discussion. This is fantastic. But this is authentic. This is who we are.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break here for the noon hour on the East Coast, and we will be back at 1 o'clock with our next presenter, who is Susan Bryn Long. She goes by Bryn, so that's what I will call her. And we will see you in about an hour and a half. Take care, everybody. Thank you again, Samantha.
Bye.